The alkali dust was a living thing, a pale ghost that clung to the air and coated her tongue with the taste of grit and despair. It rose in soft puffs around her bare feet, each step a fresh agony on the baked, cracked earth. Stones, sharp as filed teeth, bit into her soles, but the pain was a distant drumbeat against the frantic thunder of her heart. Behind her, the sun bled out across the horizon, staining the vast, indifferent sky in hues of violet and bruised orange, colors that mocked the black and blue mottling her skin. The world was ending in a silent, terrible beauty, and all Alara could do was run from the man who had authored her ruin. The memory of his voice, thick with whiskey and rage, was a spur in her side, more potent than any physical blow. It was the crack of his leather belt against the floorboards that had been the final signal, the sound that had finally severed the last, frayed tether of a daughter's duty. She had not waited for it to find her back again. She had simply turned and fled, out the splintered door and into the unforgiving gloaming, with nothing but a threadbare cotton dress and the terror that gave her wings. Now those wings were failing. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing intake of fire. The muscles in her legs screamed, knotted and trembling with exhaustion. The prairie stretched on forever, a cruel, flat expanse that offered no sanctuary, no place to hide. Every shadow seemed to mock her, twisting into the familiar, hulking shape of her father. She stumbled, her ankle turning on a loose rock, and fell hard, the impact jarring through her bones and stealing the last of her breath in a choked sob. Lying there, gasping against the cool earth, she tasted the salt of her own tears mingling with the dust on her lips. It was over. He would find her. The thought was a cold stone in her belly. The rhythmic thudding she heard was no longer just her heart. It was something else, a heavier, more deliberate beat carrying over the plains. Hoofbeats, steady, inexorable, drawing closer. She squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer dying on her lips. She did not have the strength to get up, nor the will to try. The sound stopped just a few feet away. A long shadow fell over her, blocking the last of the dying light. She waited for the familiar, calloused hand to grab her hair, for the growled curse to precede the blow. But there was only silence, a vast and terrifying quiet broken by the soft snort of a horse and the creak of worn leather. When she finally forced her eyes open, she wasn't looking up at her father. The man who stood over her was a stranger, tall and lean in the saddle, his form a stark silhouette against the deepening twilight. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his features, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and assessing. He did not dismount immediately. He simply sat there on his dark horse, watching her with an unnerving stillness, as if she were a piece of the landscape, a fallen branch or a spooked coyote. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her exhaustion. One monster had been replaced by another. This was the way of the world, she knew. A woman alone was prey, and the wilderness was full of predators. He was built of the same hard materials as the land itself, all leather and dust and quiet menace. She braced herself, curling inward, making herself smaller. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost him some effort, he swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots made a soft thud in the dirt. He was even taller on his feet, a tower of a man who blocked out the sky. He took a step closer, and she flinched violently, a whimper escaping her throat. He stopped. He stood there for another long moment, his hands held loosely at his sides, before he turned back to his horse, untying a canteen from the saddle horn. He walked back to her, his steps measured, and uncorked it. He crouched, not too close, and held it out. The water inside sloshed, a sound more beautiful than any music. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked and bleeding, but she stared at the canteen as if it were a coiled snake. Nothing was given for free. She knew the price of a man's kindness. He seemed to understand her hesitation. He said nothing, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He simply set the canteen on the ground between them, then straightened up and stepped back, giving her space. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to every brutal lesson her life had taught her, that it broke through her fear. Trembling, she reached for it, her fingers clumsy. She drank, the cool water a shock, a blessing, a pain as it coursed down her raw throat. She drank until she coughed, sputtering, then drank again. When she was finished, a sliver of strength had returned. It was just enough to fuel a fresh wave of terror. He watched her, his silence a heavy blanket. Then he moved. In one swift, fluid motion, he bent down, sliding one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. She cried out, a small, panicked sound, and struggled weakly, but his hold was like iron. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, his arms a cradle of shocking strength. He carried her to the horse and, with an economy of movement that spoke of immense power, swung her up into the saddle before mounting behind her. She was pressed against him, the solid wall of his chest at her back, his arm a firm bar across her waist. He smelled of dust, sweat, and horse, a scent as raw and elemental as the land itself. He clicked his tongue, and the horse began to walk, carrying her away from the life she had fled and into a future more uncertain and more terrifying than any she could have imagined. She was no longer running. She had been caught. The journey was a long, waking dream, a blur of motion and sensation. The steady, swaying gait of the horse was a hypnotic rhythm that lulled her in and out of a thin, exhausted sleep. Each time she drifted, her head would loll back against the solid plane of his chest, and the alien intimacy of the contact would jolt her awake again, her heart hammering with a fresh spike of fear. He never spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the plod of hooves on dry earth, the sigh of the night wind through sparse grass, and the creak of saddle leather. She remained rigid in his hold, a captured bird feigning death, every muscle tensed for a fight she knew she could not win. She watched the landscape shift and change in the moonlight, the flat plains giving way to low, rolling hills dotted with skeletal junipers. The world felt immense, empty, and she felt infinitesimally small within it, a lost mote of dust at the mercy of this silent, formidable man. She tried to study him in furtive glances, turning her head just enough to see the strong line of his jaw, darkened with stubble, the firm set of his mouth. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, as if carved from the unforgiving rock of the surrounding hills. It was a face that gave nothing away, a mask of stoic neutrality that was more unnerving than open hostility. She could not read him, could not guess at his intent, and the not knowing was a unique form of torture. They arrived hours later, as the first hint of gray was softening the eastern sky. A cabin materialized from the darkness, a low, dark shape crouched against the base of a stony rise. It was not a home. It was a shelter, stark and solitary, looking as though it had grown from the earth itself. A small corral stood beside it, and a lone cottonwood tree, its leaves whispering in the pre-dawn breeze, seemed to stand guard. He reined the horse to a halt and dismounted in one fluid motion. For a moment, she thought he might leave her there, but he reached up, his large hands spanning her waist, and lifted her down. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled beneath her. He steadied her easily, his grip firm on her arms, holding her upright until she found her footing. The ground was cold beneath her bruised feet. He let her go and led the horse toward a trough, his movements economical and unhurried. Alara stood frozen by the cabin door, wrapping her arms around herself. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and pine. This place felt like the edge of the world. He finished with the horse and turned to her. He gestured toward the cabin door with a slight inclination of his head. It was not a request. She obeyed, her feet dragging. She pushed open the heavy plank door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cool, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. A single room, sparsely furnished. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a narrow cot was tucked into a corner. Everything was neat, worn, and meticulously clean. It was a place of solitude, of function over comfort. He followed her in, his presence immediately shrinking the small space. He lit a lantern, and the room bloomed in a soft yellow light, chasing the shadows into the corners. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers and adding a few small logs. A tiny flame flickered, then caught, its warmth a welcome promise against the chill. He did all of this without a word, without so much as a glance in her direction. It was as if she were a ghost, a presence he was choosing to ignore. He straightened up from the fire and walked to a small pantry. He took out a tin plate, a piece of hard bread, and a wedge of cheese, setting them on the table. Then he pointed to a door she hadn't noticed, set in the far wall. "There," he said. His voice was rough, low and gravelly from disuse. It was the first word he had spoken to her, and it startled her like a gunshot. She looked from the food to the door, her mind slow to comprehend. He seemed to read her confusion, or perhaps her fear. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture toward the door again. "Sleep," then he turned, took his hat from the hook by the door, and walked back outside, shutting the main door firmly behind him, leaving her alone in the lantern light. The sudden solitude was as shocking as his presence had been. She stood motionless for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire. Cautiously, she approached the table. The bread and cheese seemed an impossible offering. She was ravenous, but the thought of eating felt like a betrayal of her fear, an acceptance of this strange, silent charity. Her stomach cramped with hunger, overriding her hesitation. She ate quickly, mechanically, not tasting the food, her eyes darting around the small, quiet room. Then, drawn by a will that was not her own, she moved to the door he had indicated. It opened into a small, windowless alcove, barely larger than the narrow bed it contained. A single, clean-smelling wool blanket was folded neatly at its foot. It was a cell, but it was also a sanctuary. She sank onto the thin mattress, the exhaustion she had held at bay for so long finally crashing over her in a great, dark wave. She did not know his name. She did not know if he meant to harm her or help her, if he was a savior or a captor. But for the first time in days, she was warm, she had food in her belly, and there was a solid door between her and the world. She pulled the rough blanket up to her chin and, for the first time since she'd fled, slept. The first days passed in a haze of silence and cautious observation. Alara learned the rhythm of the homestead not through words, but through sound and motion. The man, whose name she still did not know, rose before the sun. She would hear the scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water from the wash basin, the soft clink of him preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and bread. Then, the front door would open and close, and he would be gone, swallowed by the vastness of the land. He worked from dawn until the last light faded from the sky, a tireless figure she would sometimes watch from the doorway, a distant shape moving with purpose across the landscape, mending fences, tending to his horse, doing the endless work that this harsh country demanded. He never approached her, never sought her out. He simply left a portion of food for her on the table each morning before he left, and again in the evening when he returned, caked in the dust and sweat of his labor. He would eat his own meal in silence, his focus on his plate, and then retreat to his cot, leaving her to the relative privacy of the small alcove. The silence was a language all its own. In the house of her father, silence had been a prelude to violence, a taut, breathless waiting for the storm to break. Here it was different. It was a solid, grounding thing, as much a part of the cabin as the stone hearth or the wooden beams. It was the natural state of this man and of this place. Slowly, cautiously, Alara began to inhabit the space he had given her. At first, she did little more than huddle in her small room, the terror of her escape still a fresh, weeping wound. But the idleness chafed at her, a luxury she had never known and did not trust. She began to move about the cabin during the long, empty days. She found a broom and swept the floors, the repetitive motion a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She washed the few dishes, scrubbed the tabletop, and straightened the blankets, imposing a small measure of order on her chaotic world. These were the tasks of a prisoner, perhaps, but they were also the tasks of a survivor. They were a way of claiming a piece of this life, however temporary, as her own. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds. Her mother had taught her the language of growing things, one of the few gentle legacies she possessed. With her bare hands, she began to pull the weeds, to turn the soil, her fingers finding a forgotten comfort in the feel of the earth. She found a bucket and drew water from the well, carefully nursing the struggling plants back to a semblance of life. The work was hard, her body ached, but it was a clean pain, an earned pain. It was hers. She watched him whenever she could, from the corner of her eye or through the cabin's single, grimy window. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet competence that wasted no motion. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horse, his rough hands stroking the animal's neck, his low voice a soft murmur she could not quite hear. A man who was kind to his animals, her mother had once said, held a kernel of goodness in him. Alara was not sure she believed it. Kindness was a currency she did not possess and could not afford. Yet she watched. She saw the weariness in his shoulders when he returned at dusk, the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. This land took its toll on everyone, even a man as hard as this one. He seemed less a monster now, and more a part of this unforgiving place, shaped by the same wind and sun that weathered the rocks. One morning, she awoke to find something new by her door. Pair of boots. They were old, the leather scuffed and softened with wear, but they were sturdy. They were far too large for her, but he had stuffed the toes with scraps of soft cloth so they might fit. She stared at them for a full minute, her heart a confused, fluttering thing in her chest. It was not a gift of kindness. She told herself it was a practical matter. He could not have a barefoot woman slowing him down, should he decide to be rid of her. But as she slipped her bruised and swollen feet into them, the worn leather a soft caress, she felt a flicker of something she could not name. It felt dangerously close to gratitude. She wore the boots as she went out to the garden that day, her steps more solid, more sure on the rocky ground. When he returned that evening, he glanced at her feet, and then his gaze met hers for a fleeting second across the room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The sky had been a flat, metallic gray for 2 days, the air thick and heavy with an unspoken threat. Alara felt it in her bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the tension coiling in her gut. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. It did not arrive gently. It fell upon the small homestead with a primal fury, a deafening assault of wind and rain that seemed intent on scouring the cabin from the face of the earth. The world beyond the single window dissolved into a churning gray chaos. Rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 angry fists, and the wind shrieked through the eaves, a mournful, keening sound that scraped at Alara's nerves. The man, Silas. She had finally learned his name from a faded inscription on a saddlebag, had spent the morning securing the homestead, his movements economical and urgent as he battened down anything that might be torn away by the gale. Now, they were trapped together inside the small, dim space, the storm raging around them like a physical manifestation of the unspoken tension that filled the air between them. The cabin, which had begun to feel like a tentative sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Silas sat at the table, methodically working on a piece of leather tack, his head bent, the lantern light casting his angular features in sharp relief. His focus was absolute, his hands steady and sure as he mended a broken strap. Alara sat on a small stool by the hearth, a mending basket in her lap, her fingers fumbling with a needle and thread. The simple act of sewing, usually a comfort, felt impossible. Every gust of wind made her jump, her body tensing as if expecting a blow. The storm was too much like her father's rages, the sudden violence, the feeling of being trapped, the terrifying lack of control. She could feel Silas's presence across the room, a solid, silent weight. He was an immovable object in the heart of the chaos, his calm a stark contrast to her own inner turmoil. The silence inside was louder than the storm outside. It was a living thing, full of questions she was too afraid to ask and answers he seemed unwilling to give. Why had he brought her here? What did he want from her? Was she a guest? A prisoner? Or simply a piece of salvage he'd picked up on the prairie? Hours crept by. The storm showed no sign of abating. The relentless noise was wearing her down, stripping away the fragile layers of composure she had built over the past weeks. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the very timbers groan in protest. A log in the fireplace shifted and popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Alara flinched violently, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of blood welled, dark against her pale skin. She stared at it, transfixed, as the memory of other blood, other pains, rose up to choke her. Across the room, the methodical scrape of Silas's knife on leather stopped. She looked up to find him watching her, his gaze steady and direct. His eyes, the color of slate under a stormy sky, seemed to see right through her, into the frightened, broken places she kept hidden. The intensity of his scrutiny was unnerving, yet it was not unkind. It was simply observant. "You are safe here," he said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the roar of the wind. It was the first full sentence he had ever spoken to her. It was not a question, not an offer of comfort, but a simple statement of fact. As if he were stating that the sky was gray or the fire was hot. Her throat felt tight, a knot of unshed tears forming. She wanted to believe him, but safety was a foreign country, a language she had never learned. She shook her head, a small, involuntary motion. "Nowhere is safe," she whispered, the words barely audible. He considered this for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. He set down his work with deliberate care. "My father, he will look for me," she added, the admission costing her a piece of her soul. It was the first time she had given voice to her deepest fear. Silas's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. He did not offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. He simply nodded, a slow, grave acknowledgement of her truth. "Let him," he said, and the two words carried more weight, more solid promise, than 1,000 pretty speeches. He was not promising that her father would not come. He was promising that it would not matter if he did. He then picked up his leatherwork again, the rhythmic scraping sound resuming its steady beat. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, something had irrevocably shifted. The silence that returned was not empty. It was filled with his two words, a foundation stone laid between them in the heart of the tempest. For the first time, Alara felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen, just a fraction. She looked down at her sewing, her hands a little steadier now, and slowly, carefully, threaded her needle once more. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. In its wake, a subtle but definite change settled over the homestead. It was as if the violence of the tempest had cleared the air not only outside, but within the cabin's walls as well. The silence between Alara and Silas remained, but it was now a more comfortable, companionable thing, less a void and more a shared space. She no longer felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. She began to take on more responsibilities around the small patch of land, not out of a sense of obligation, but from a burgeoning desire to contribute, to earn her keep in a currency other than fear. She took over the care of the half-dozen scrawny chickens he kept in a small coop, her quiet patience seeming to soothe the nervous birds. She learned to identify the edible herbs and roots that grew in the rocky soil of the hillsides, adding them to their simple, repetitive meals of beans and salted meat. The work grounded her, each task a small act of defiance against the helplessness that had defined her for so long. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to domestic chores, grew calloused and strong. The sun browned her skin, and the wind whipped color into her cheeks. She was still thin, still bore the phantom aches of old injuries, but a new resilience was taking root within her, as tough and tenacious as the wildflowers that pushed their way through the cracks in the rock. One late afternoon, she saw him riding in, his posture slumped in the saddle. Even from a distance, she knew something was wrong. He usually rode with a straight-backed ease, a perfect union of man and horse. Now he leaned heavily to one side, his movements stiff and pained. As he drew closer, she saw the dark stains spreading across the thigh of his worn trousers and the grim, pale set of his jaw. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her for a moment before a different instinct took over. Not fear for herself, but for him. She ran from the cabin, her borrowed boots kicking up dust, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached him just as he was clumsily trying to dismount. His leg gave way, and he would have fallen if she hadn't been there to brace him. His full weight sagged against her, and the scent of sweat and blood filled her senses. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm. "Horse spooked. Fell on a bad rock," he gritted out, his breath hissing between his teeth. He was a large man, and she struggled under his weight, but she wrapped an arm around his waist, half supporting, half guiding him toward the cabin. Getting him inside and onto his cot was a monumental effort that left them both breathless. The wound was a deep, jagged gash on his outer thigh, oozing blood and clogged with dirt and torn fabric. It was ugly, and it needed cleaning. The sight of it should have sent her reeling, but instead, a strange calm settled over her. This was something she could fix. This was a hurt she understood. Her mother, for all her timidity in the face of her husband's rage, had been a healer, her knowledge of poultices and remedies a small, secret power. Alara had been her quiet apprentice. "I need hot water. And clean rags," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She took charge, moving about the cabin with a newfound purpose. While the water heated, she gathered what she needed. A clean cloth, the small bottle of whiskey he kept for rare occasions, and the dried yarrow leaves she had gathered from the hills. He watched her from the cot. His gray eyes narrowed with pain, but he did not protest. He lay back, his powerful body rendered vulnerable, and allowed her to take control. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she cut away the torn fabric of his trousers. She cleaned the wound meticulously, first with the hot water, then with a whiskey-soaked rag that made him flinch and suck in a sharp breath, though he made no other sound. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements efficient. She made a thick poultice of the yarrow and packed it into the gash to staunch the bleeding and ward off infection, then bound it tightly with strips of clean cotton. When she was finished, she wiped the sweat from his brow with a cool, damp cloth. He was pale, but the bleeding had slowed to a trickle. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. His vulnerability was a raw, open thing in the small room. For weeks, he had been her protector, her silent, powerful guardian. Now their roles were reversed. She was the caregiver and he, the one in need. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. She just nodded, her throat too thick with a strange mix of emotions to speak. She had tended to his wound, and in doing so had tended to a part of herself. She had met a crisis not with fear, but with capability. She had not run. She had acted. As she cleaned up, she could feel his gaze on her, a steady, quiet weight. The balance between them had shifted, subtly but seismically. They were no longer just a man who had rescued a girl. They were two people bound by a shared hardship, a shared wound, and a shared, silent strength. The larder was growing bare, and Silas's leg, though healing cleanly under Alara's care, was not yet strong enough for a long ride. The trip to town was a necessity they could no longer postpone. The thought of it filled Alara with a gnawing dread. The small, isolated homestead had become her entire world, a sanctuary where she felt, if not entirely safe, then at least invisible. To go into a town, to be among people, to be seen, it felt like stepping out of a burrow into a field full of hawks. But Silas needed salt and flour, coffee and ammunition, and she needed thread for mending. He hitched their single horse to a small, buckboard wagon, his movements still stiff. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She squared her shoulders and nodded, fetching her bonnet. She could not let him go alone, not while he was still favoring his leg. The ride was tense. The open prairie, which she had begun to see as a place of stark beauty, now felt menacingly exposed. Every distant dust cloud could be a rider. Every sound on the wind could be a threat. Silas seemed to sense her unease. He did not speak, but he drove the wagon at a steady, unhurried pace, his presence beside her a solid, reassuring weight. The town, when they reached it, was little more than a dusty main street with a handful of false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. But to Alara, it was a swirling vortex of noise and people. After weeks of near-total silence, the sounds of voices, barking dogs, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer were a jarring assault on her senses. People turned to stare as they drove past. They stared at Silas, a man they clearly recognized but did not seem to know well, his solitary nature setting him apart. And they stared at her, a strange woman at his side. Their gazes were sharp and probing, full of a hungry, unkind curiosity. She felt her skin prickle, and she instinctively pulled the brim of her bonnet lower, trying to disappear. Inside the general store, the feeling of being scrutinized intensified. The air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dried goods. A group of women, clustered near the fabric bolts, stopped their chatter to watch her, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. She could feel their judgment, could almost hear the words they were thinking. Who is she? Where did he find her? Their eyes raked over her worn dress, her oversized boots, her pale, tense face. It was a different kind of violence from her father's, but it was a violation all the same, a stripping away of her dignity that left her feeling raw and exposed. She focused on her task, her hands trembling slightly as she selected a spool of thread. Silas, meanwhile, conducted his business with the storekeeper, his voice a low, steady murmur. He seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he was simply immune to them, wrapped in an armor of indifference she envied. As they were about to leave, a man stepped in front of them, blocking their path. He was burly and red-faced, smelling of stale beer and sweat. He leered at Alara, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her stomach clench. "Well now, Silas," the man drawled, his voice loud and slurring. "Didn't know you'd gone and got yourself some company. Where you been hiding this pretty little thing?" Alara froze, the old, familiar paralysis seizing her. She felt small and helpless, her throat closing up. Silas did not answer. He simply shifted his position slightly, placing himself more fully between her and the other man. It was a small movement, but it was a clear and deliberate barrier. His face remained impassive, but a coldness entered his eyes, a stillness that was more menacing than any outward show of anger. "We're leaving Cooper," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Cooper laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Not so fast. Just wantin' to be neighborly." He reached out a grimy hand as if to touch Alara's arm. Before his fingers could make contact, Silas's hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. The movement was impossibly fast, a blur of motion. Silas didn't squeeze, didn't apply visible pressure, but Cooper's face went pale, his bravado instantly evaporating. "Let go of me," Cooper wheezed, his eyes wide. Silas held his grip for a second longer, his cold gaze unwavering. Then he released him. Cooper stumbled back, rubbing his wrist, all the fight gone out of him. He muttered a curse and scurried away. The store fell silent, all eyes on them. Silas paid the storekeeper, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. He picked up their supplies and, with a firm hand on Alara's elbow, guided her out of the store and back into the sunlight. On the ride back to the homestead, the silence was different yet again. It was not empty, nor was it companionable. It was charged, humming with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alara kept replaying the scene in her mind. The leering face of the man, her own paralyzing fear, and the swift, silent way Silas had shielded her. He had not raised his voice, had not thrown a punch, but he had protected her absolutely. He had built a wall around her with nothing more than his presence. She glanced at his profile as he drove, at the hard line of his jaw and the quiet focus in his eyes. The homestead was no longer just a sanctuary from her past. He was the sanctuary. They were a week shy of the first frost when the rider appeared. Elara saw him first, a dark speck on the vast, golden plain, slowly resolving into the shape of a man on a horse. It was not the casual, meandering pace of a lost traveler. This rider moved with a grim, relentless purpose, heading directly for their homestead. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She had lived with a fragile peace for months, a peace she knew was borrowed time. Now the debt was coming due. She stood frozen by the well, the bucket halfway up, her knuckles white on the rope. She watched until she was sure, until the rider was close enough for her to see the cruel set of his shoulders and the rifle resting in the scabbard by his saddle. It was not her father. In some ways, that was worse. Her father was a known quantity, his rages predictable in their chaos. This man was a stranger, and his presence here could only mean one thing. He was a hunter and she was his quarry. She dropped the rope, the bucket clattering back down the well, and ran for the cabin. Silas was inside, cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. He looked up as she burst in, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "A rider!" she gasped, her voice thin and reedy. "He's coming this way." Silas didn't ask questions. He rose smoothly to his feet, his movements calm and deliberate. He walked to the door and looked out, his body a solid silhouette in the frame. He watched the approaching rider for a long, silent moment, his face impassive. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and even. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the door swing shut behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the cabin. She rushed to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. The man rode into the yard and dismounted, his movements arrogant and proprietary. He was not large, but he was wiry and mean-looking, with pale, restless eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He swaggered toward the porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "You Silas?" the man called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. Silas stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, saying nothing. He was a rock, an immovable object against which the other man's aggression seemed to break and founder. "I'm looking for a runaway," the man continued, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Girl named Elara. Her father, a respected man, sent me to fetch her. Got a warrant right here," he patted a pocket on his chest. "Says she's his property." Elara flinched as if struck. Property. The word stole her breath, reducing her to a thing, an object to be reclaimed. All the strength she had painstakingly built over the past months crumbled, leaving her a trembling child again, hiding in the shadows. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. She could see Silas's back, the rigid set of his shoulders. He still hadn't moved. "There's no one here by that name," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as a winter river. The lie was so bald, so absolute, that it took Elara's breath away. The man, whose name she would later learn was Jeb, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't play dumb with me. I've been tracking her for weeks. Town folk back there said you rode in with a woman looked just like her. Now you can hand her over easy or we can do this the hard way. Makes no difference to me, but the hard way pays better." He let his hand drop from his pocket to rest more deliberately on his pistol. The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. Elara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the subtle shift in Silas's posture, the way his weight settled, the almost imperceptible tensing of the muscles in his back and shoulders. He was preparing for a fight. He was going to fight for her. This man who owed her nothing, this silent stranger who had taken her in, was going to stand against the monster her father had sent. The fear that had paralyzed her began to burn, transforming into something else, something hot and fierce. It was rage, a lifetime of swallowed screams, of endured blows, of suffocating silence, ignited within her. They could not have her. She would not let them. She was not property. Jeb, the tracker, grew tired of the standoff. His sneer tightened, and his patience, clearly a shallow commodity, ran out. "I'm done talkin'," he spat, and took a decisive step toward the porch stairs. "I'll fetch her myself." Silas moved to block him. He didn't draw a weapon or raise his voice. He simply shifted his body, becoming a human wall. "You're not welcome here," he stated, his voice still dangerously quiet. "Turn your horse and ride out." For a moment, Jeb seemed to reconsider, faced with the sheer, unyielding presence of the man before him. But greed and arrogance won out. With a guttural roar, he lunged up the stairs, throwing a wild punch. The violence, when it came, was nothing like the clumsy, drunken brawls Alara had witnessed from her father. It was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Silas moved with a deadly grace she never would have imagined, deflecting the punch with one arm while his other hand struck Jeb hard in the solar plexus. The air left the tracker in a whoosh, his eyes bugging out. He staggered back, gasping, but recovered quickly, his face contorted with rage. He drew his pistol, a blur of motion. But Silas was faster. He closed the distance between them, his hand clamping down on Jeb's wrist, forcing the gun's barrel toward the sky. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet tearing harmlessly through the porch roof. The sound jolted Alara from her horrified trance. They grappled, two bodies locked in a desperate, silent struggle. It was all hard muscle and gritted teeth. The only sounds the scuffle of their boots on the wooden planks and their harsh, ragged breaths. Silas was stronger, but Jeb was wiry and fought dirty, clawing and kicking. He managed to break free and swung the heavy pistol like a club, catching Silas on the side of the head. Silas staggered, a dark line of blood appearing at his temple. He shook his head as if to clear it, and in that split second of vulnerability, Jeb saw his chance. He turned his attention to the cabin door, a cruel grin splitting his face. "Time to collect my fee," he snarled, shoving past the dazed Silas. In that moment, something inside Alara broke. Not in surrender, but in a final, cataclysmic shattering of fear. The image of this vile man laying a hand on her, dragging her back to that life of pain and shame, was more than she could bear. She was no longer a frightened girl cowering by a window. She wrenched the cabin door open and stepped out onto the porch just as Jeb reached for the handle. In her hand, she held the heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth. She didn't think. She acted. She swung it with all the force of her newfound strength, all the desperation of a cornered animal, all the fury of a lifetime of abuse. The iron met the side of Jeb's head with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the porch floor like a sack of grain, utterly unconscious. The skillet fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the boards. Silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind and her own ragged breathing. Silas, wiping the blood from his temple with the back of his hand, stared at her. His face was a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and something else, something that looked like awe. Alara stood over the fallen man, her chest heaving, her whole body trembling not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying power. She looked from the unconscious form of her pursuer to Silas. Then she found her voice. It was not the whisper he was used to. It was clear, steady, and resonant with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Tell him," she said, her voice ringing with cold command as she looked at the fallen tracker. "If he or anyone else ever comes for me again, I will not be so merciful." She was not asking for protection. She was making a declaration. She stood beside Silas, not behind him. An equal, partner, a survivor who had finally, truly fought back. The aftermath settled over the homestead with a profound and heavy quiet. The air, once charged with violence, was now still. Silas bound the unconscious tracker's hands and feet with a length of rope, his movements methodical. He searched Jeb's pockets, removing the pistol, a knife, and a folded piece of paper, the warrant. He glanced at the document, his mouth tightening into a thin, hard line, before he crumpled it in his fist. He did not speak, and Alara did not press him to. Words felt inadequate flimsy things in the face of what had just happened. Together, they dragged the man to the small shed where Silas stored his tools and locked him inside. He would deal with him in the morning, ride him far away and leave him with a warning that would be etched into his memory. But for now, the threat was contained. Back in the cabin, the aftermath of the struggle was starkly visible. An overturned chair, the lingering, acrid smell of gunpowder, the dark smear of Silas's blood on the floor where he had staggered. Alara moved automatically, setting the chair upright, opening the window to let the clean, crisp air in. She fetched the water basin and a clean cloth and, without a word, began to tend to the gash on Silas's temple. This time, her hands did not tremble. Her touch was sure and steady. He sat at the table, submitting to her care, his gray eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. He had a shallow cut on his cheekbone and blooming bruises on his knuckles, but the head wound was the worst. As she gently cleaned it, their faces were inches apart. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the flecks of a lighter gray in his irises. She could feel the warmth of his breath. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution or uncertainty. It was a shared intimacy, forged in the crucible of violence and survival. When she was finished, she moved to the hearth to rekindle the fire, which had dwindled to embers. The familiar, domestic act was a comfort, a way of reclaiming their space, of scrubbing it clean of the day's ugliness. Silas remained at the table, watching her. The crumpled warrant lay on the wood beside his hand. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You were brave." Alara paused, her back to him, her hand on the mantelpiece. Brave. The word seemed to belong to someone else. What she had felt was not bravery, but a savage, cornered desperation. "I was afraid," she confessed quietly. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said, and the simple profundity of it settled deep in her bones. "It's acting in spite of it." She turned to face him then, and a true, unspoken understanding passed between them in the flickering firelight. They were both survivors, marked by a world that had tried to break them. They had recognized the same resilient core in each other from the very beginning. Silas reached for a small, locked wooden box he kept on a high shelf. He opened it with a key from his pocket and took out a folded, yellow document. It was the deed to the homestead, his name written on it in a clear, strong hand. He took a pen and a bottle of ink from a drawer. He uncorked the ink, dipped the nib, and then looked at her, a silent, profound question in his gaze. He slid the deed across the table toward her. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the paper, at the blank space below his name. She understood. This was not a proposal of marriage, not a declaration of love in the conventional sense. It was something deeper, something more real. It was an offer of partnership, of permanence, of a home. He was offering her a stake in the world, a place to stand her ground, a name to put on a piece of land that was her own. With a hand that was perfectly steady, she took the pen from his outstretched fingers. Her own name, Alara, flowed onto the paper below his. She was no longer a runaway. She was no longer property. She was a homesteader. She was a partner. She was free. Later, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, they stood together on the porch, a mug of hot coffee warming Alara's hands. The vast, empty land that had once terrified her now seemed to hold a world of promise. It was not a gentle land, but it was honest. It demanded strength and paid in resilience. She looked at the man standing beside her, a silent pillar of strength who had given her the space to find her own. He had not saved her, not in the way storybooks told it. He had caught her when she fell, and then he had given her the ground on which to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. And for that she would be eternally grateful. The sun broke over the distant hills, flooding the world with clean, golden light. A new day, a new life. It would be hard, but it would be theirs. And together they were strong enough to face it.